We continue now with Tom Jarrell's report, A Moment of Crisis, the Beirut bombing. A question that must be asked is why 241 men were killed by terrorists, yet this country wasn't outraged. There were no demonstrations, no marches, little outcry. The reason? Within 48 hours of the bombing, the United States invaded Grenada. It triggered a rebirth of patriotism in this country, and many of President Reagan's critics feel that that protected him from criticism on the Beirut bombing. But where does the blame lie? Tom Jarrell and the 2020 team have spent the last 5 months looking for the answer to that question. They've interviewed scores of people, and some were privy to facts that Washington has never revealed. As Tom Jarrell tells us, even before our Marines were sent to Beirut, events were unfolding that would seal their fate.
June 6, 1982. Israel invaded Lebanon. The goal was to drive out Palestinian guerrillas. The United States was working furiously to obtain a ceasefire. August 25, 1982. The U.S. Marines landed in Beirut as part of a ceasefire agreement.
Go, Marines!
Their job? To oversee the evacuation of the Palestine Liberation Organization from Lebanon. 17 days later, the Marines went home. Mission accomplished, they thought. September 16, 1982. The shocking massacre of Palestinian civilians by Lebanese Christians sympathetic to Israel. Over 800 died. Once again, it seemed that Lebanon was on the verge of chaos. 2 weeks later, the Marines came back to keep the many Lebanese factions from tearing each other apart.
The participation of American forces in Beirut will again be for a limited period. But I have concluded there is no alternative to their returning to Lebanon if that country is to have a chance to stand on its own feet.
But the Marines were not in Lebanon for a limited period of time. They were there for 18 months, and their role got more confusing and dangerous as each month passed. At first, the Marines were welcomed along with a multinational force of French, British, and Italian troops. The job was to shore up the weak central government and keep out of the feuds that are part of Lebanon's history. There were problems, specifically that as peacekeepers, the Marines could not have their weapons loaded, except during patrols. Neither could they fire unless fired upon. Robert Jordan was one of the top officers in Beirut.
It was obviously a show, and the operations were geared to that. For example, the first few weeks that I was there, it was like a three-ring circus. It was come see the Marines jump from helicopters, come watch the Lebanese armed forces and the Marines at an infiltration course. We were more concerned with causing unnecessary civilian casualties or precipitating some kind of a conflict than we were with our own security.
But security was only one problem the Marines faced in Lebanon. 2020 has investigated what happened in Beirut and whether or not the attack on the Marines could have been prevented. Our investigation shows that 1, the Reagan administration ignored key information linking Syria and Iran to terrorist attacks in Beirut. 2, bureaucratic infighting in Washington almost certainly cost lives in Lebanon. And 3, a key planner of the attack on the Marine compound has emerged as one of the world's most effective terrorists.
April 18, 1983. 7 months after the Marines arrived, the first major attack against Americans. A car filled with plastic explosives rammed the American embassy. 63 people died, of them 17 Americans, including nearly every top official of the Central Intelligence Agency based in the Middle East.
At first, we were checking off a lot of names. Somebody would say, I saw Frank, I saw Ryan, he's okay. But after about an hour, it started running out, and there were big gaps in the list. So it took really an hour to understand the extent of the tragedy.
Robert Dillon was then the American ambassador in Lebanon.
The danger that was not sufficiently recognized was the suicide attack. Until it actually happened, it's hard to believe that people will deliberately commit suicide in order to make that attack.
Because of the new tactics, the use of a suicide bomber and high explosives, the CIA and the Defense Department each sent secret teams to find out what happened.
2020 has learned that the teams discovered the embassy attack with almost a carbon copy of the bombing of the Marine compound. the same methods, the same explosives, even the same planners. The CIA also found direct ties to Syria and Iran, but that evidence apparently was ignored.
One American intelligence officer agreed to speak with 2020 as long as his identity was protected.
The people that actually planned the show and ran the show were the Syrians, and somewhere in Damascus, where these meetings were held, the Iranians stood up and said, we'll throw in X number of dollars for this operation, and the Syrians said, well, heavens, if you're going to throw that much money, we'll throw in our part, we'll give you the expertise.
2020 has learned that 5 men arrested in Lebanon for their involvement in the embassy attack described meetings here in Damascus with top Syrian intelligence officials. The CIA found letters describing a master plan for attacks on 7 American targets in Lebanon. The men claim the Syrians helped construct the sophisticated car bomb. They claim Iran provided the explosives and paid the bills.
Syrian Foreign Minister Farouk al-Shara, in an interview with 2020, denied that his government was involved.
We never assisted to terrorism. We were against terrorism. We have suffered from terrorism. But we supported resistance, only resistance.
Despite denials from Syria and Iran, knowledgeable sources here in Damascus maintain that both governments were involved. The attacks against the embassy and later the Marines were approved at the top levels of the Syrian government. Although President Hafez al-Assad was not specifically involved in the decision, 2 of his senior aides in the Syrian Air Force helped coordinate the plan. From here in Damascus, the government of Iran moved money and explosives to its operatives in Lebanon. May 17, 1983, the stakes got higher. Just 1 month after the embassy explosion, Lebanon and Israel signed a peace treaty. It was the first foreign policy success for George Shultz. Shortly thereafter, Robert McFarlane became Middle East envoy. Together, they wanted the Marines to stay in Lebanon to help supervise the treaty. But Caspar Weinberger and the military leaders, deeply concerned after the embassy explosion, thought the Marines were sitting ducks and should be pulled out. Remember that the Marines were still patrolling Beirut and would become the next targets of terrorism. The treaty increased anti-American sentiment in the region. Iran and Syria opposed the treaty and viewed the Marines not as neutral peacekeepers, but as key enforcers of U.S. policy in Lebanon.
Their objective was to take part in the conflict, not to stabilize Lebanon.
Despite the evidence linking Syria to the attack on the U.S. embassy, the Reagan administration wanted Syria to endorse the peace plan in Lebanon. 2020 has learned that most of the men who confessed to the bombing of the embassy, as incredible as it seems, were set free in an apparent effort to appease Syria. The CIA investigators strongly disagreed with that decision in the first of a series of bureaucratic battles among American policymakers.
It's incomprehensible to me that they are willing, with full knowledge of who is behind the attack, to allow them to go free and unharmed. The U.S. government's official policy towards the bombing of the U.S. embassy was, let's forget about it.
Then more bureaucratic infighting. Some of the key intelligence concerning the embassy attack apparently was not shared with the Marines.
The embassy's been blown. You know, a mental midget could figure out that the Marines are the next target. And yet, there were no special precautions taken at the Marine compound.
After the embassy attack and before the Marines were bombed, a secret Defense Department team went to Beirut to find out what was wrong with the system for gathering intelligence about terrorism. They found faults, but the recommendations to improve things were shot down in still more turf battles.
One member of that secret team that went to Beirut spoke with 2020.
There were those in the Pentagon who felt their turf was being infringed upon and therefore did not seek to see the recommendations implemented. In fact, I would say in some corners sought to undermine the credibility of the recommendations. I would say at some level it was the same at CIA. When you're talking about the lives of American servicemen, I'm not sure that protecting turf is ever appropriate.
September 1983, the situation got worse. With Syrian help, the opponents of American policy in Lebanon started to use weapons rather than words. As the battles raged around the Marines, another battle raged between America's diplomats and military men. Robert McFarlane ordered the commander in Beirut to fire on the opponents of the Lebanese government. The commander, Tim Garrity, refused, fearing the Marines would get caught in the crossfire. McFarlane insisted, even invoking the authority of the president. The Marines were no longer neutral. They had taken sides, and they fired back.
Up until that point, our flags and our appearance were greeted with smiles and warm hand waves and that sort of thing. After that period, when the naval gunfire opened up, I think we were perceived as just another faction that we no longer had credibility.
Walid Jumblat was one radical leader in Lebanon opposed to the presence of the Marines.
My only objective and task was to get the Americans out of Lebanon, whatever the means were. And still I stick to this objective.
Was there anger when Americans decided to launch attacks against your towns in Lebanon?
Terrible anger, and you know it resulted in the bombing of the headquarters of the Marines in West Beirut.
Enter the terrorist. His name, Ahmad Mughniyeh, at the time an unknown Lebanese Shiite. Mughniyeh had close ties to Hezbollah, shown here during religious rites, the same group behind the embassy attack. American intelligence sources tell 2020 that Mughniyeh, in combination with Hezbollah, has created one of the most dangerous terrorist networks in the world. At the time, Iran and Syria poured money and expertise into the group.
October 17th, 1983, 6 days before the attack on the Marine compound, there was another serious breakdown in U.S. intelligence. 2020 has learned that here in Damascus, an airplane from Iran landed. Its cargo, top-grade plastic explosives, destined for Ahmad Mughniyeh and his men. The explosives moved from Damascus by road to Beirut. The CIA did get word of that shipment. Also, the U.S. intercepted communications that Iran was paying $1 million for attacks on Americans in Lebanon. Neither report got to the Marines in time.
October 21st, 1983, just 36 hours before the explosion, another critical foul-up. A separate group of American soldiers training the Lebanese army in Beirut got information that a huge terrorist attack against the Marine compound was imminent. The Marines across town never got this critical information. In the southern suburbs of Beirut, Ahmad Mughniyeh had chosen his suicide bomber from the followers of Hezbollah. It was the same plan as the attack on the U.S. Embassy. A driver on a suicide mission, a remote control explosion. Only this bomb was 5 times larger. October 23rd, 1983. This photograph, obtained by 2020, was taken by one of those involved in the conspiracy. It was his record of one of the largest explosions in history.
Peace in Lebanon is key to the region's stability now and in the future. It is central to our credibility on a global scale. We must not allow international criminals and thugs such as these to undermine the peace.
2 months later, a military commission, the only official investigation into what happened, blamed the 2 top field commanders for failing to take adequate safety precautions. There was never any serious investigation into how the administration applied its policies in Lebanon and whether the deaths of the Marines could have been prevented. 2020 asked members of the Reagan administration to discuss the events in Lebanon. Every key official, George Shultz, Caspar Weinberger, Robert McFarlane, and others, refused.
What happened to the terrorist, Ahmad Mughniyeh? Well, he has become one of the most dangerous men in the world. American intelligence sources say that, along with members of Hezbollah, Mughniyeh was behind the hijacking of TWA Flight 847 in Beirut and the kidnapping of foreigners in Lebanon, including the 8 Americans still held hostage there. What's the attitude of Lebanese like Walid Jumblat, who helped drive out the Marines?
From the human point of view, it's a tragedy. But from the political point of view, that's life, that's war. I mean, an ordinary Marine couldn't know what was going on. He came not knowing the ground, and he died like that, stupidly.
The legacy here in Syria, its soldiers now live in what remains of the old Marine compound in Beirut. But Syria now finds itself mired in Lebanon, as did the United States. One of the main troubles, the spread of Islamic fundamentalism, fueled by Syria's old ally, Iran. The alliance between Syria and Iran does remain, but there's no longer such a clear and common enemy as the American Marines.
And the legacy for the Marines who were there, Sergeant Steve Russell.
Sometimes I'm bitter about it. I honestly enjoyed every minute in Beirut, Lebanon, except for that 1 minute.
Michael Pettit.
While all that political infighting was going on, the Marines were basically left to fend for themselves without a clear directive of why we were there.
Sergeant Kim McKinney.
Terrorism against the Marine Corps is relatively new, so, you know, we're learning, and learning takes pain, and there's a lot of pain, so it was a lot of learning from Beirut.
For the officers like Robert Jordan and the families of the victims, there's a small monument near Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The names of the dead are etched in stone, the only lasting legacy of a moment of crisis.
I'm concerned right now that in the deployment to the Persian Gulf, that we are making some of those same mistakes. We have not prepared the public for loss of more American lives. And if we're not prepared psychologically, if we don't have the public support to undergird those young men out there, then we're going to be in the same situation again.
Tom, what has happened to the survivors of that tragedy? Where are they now?
Hugh, many went through the Vietnam syndrome. They came home, they were bypassed for promotions. Many have resigned and left the Marine Corps in disgust over the whole thing.
Yeah. Why did it take so long for this story to come out?
Well, remember, this was both a military and political fiasco for the Reagan administration, and virtually everything to do with it was stamped classified, top secret. Time has passed. Some people have been so disgusted by what they knew to come.
Thank you, Tom. Well, later, have you ever wanted to be a rock star? Stay tuned. We're going to